Have you ever engaged in a serious debate over which is better, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings? Have you ever played Smash or Pass using only characters from Star Wars and Marvel movies? If you answered yes to any of these questions, we have the podcast for you. Listen to The Steam Gentleman, the podcast where an expert panel convenes to ask the questions about pop culture and social commentary that other podcasts are afraid to ask. Listen to The Steam Gentleman on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Warning, this product contains extreme nostalgia. Does your job got you down? Is adulting not as fun as you thought it would be? Do you want a way to recapture that happiness from when you were a kid? At Retrostalgia Box, you feel like a kid again. Comics, toys, and video games hand-curated from the past and straight to your door. Unbox happiness at retrostalgiabox.com. Once again, that's retrostalgiabox.com. Yeah! Welcome, everybody, to the 1987 Supermod and this special bonus episode of 80s Booking Styles. I'm your host, Brad Drake, and just as the title said, today we're going to be going over some different kinds of 80s wrestling booking styles. Now, I know that a lot of you, at least the people that I've talked with and that, a lot of you are way under 40. So many of you were not around to watch 80s wrestling and to see it firsthand and to live it and experience it. So all that you get is what is on the former WWE network, also known as Peacock, and what's available on YouTube if you have that deep of an interest in the history of wrestling. Obviously, you do if you're playing the 1987 Supermod, but I also know a lot of people just play it for fun, too, just to play a different era. So wrestling was, today doesn't even remotely resemble what wrestling was in the 80s. And, you know, what's scary to realize is that in a few years, 1980 is going to be 50 years ago. So we're going back, 35 plus years ago to this era of wrestling, and things were a lot different. Wrestling, all in all, was a lot different. In 1987, specifically for the Supermod, you still have some territories around, but not a whole lot. You've already started to see this consolidation of power of Crockett and the WWF. In Japan, you see that All Japan Pro Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling are already firmly established. Mexico's been established for a while already at this point. But it's a different era. It's a different time. What's cool about this game is the fact that we do get product types. And I recently just made the changes to the Supermod about the product types. And a guy by the name of Richard Wright helped me out with this, we went through them and figured out which would be the proper product types because it wasn't proper before in the Supermod. And we got it dialed in now. And let's just take a look at the WWF, for example. So we have them under Classic Sports Entertainment, right? So 80% of the fans will expect 80% matches, 20% angles. The fans are going to expect TV shows to be 65% matches, 35% angles. Matches are rated on a ratio between 40 and 60, 60-40, in-ring action and popularity, depending on what's getting the best rating. Okay? This is about right for the WWF. We will often hear of old-timers from pro wrestling, old-time wrestlers, that is. They'll describe, even commentators will describe it too, and by commentators I mean general media, and there's 1,000,001 80s wrestling podcasts and YouTube shows and everything else talking about 80s wrestling. They'll often describe the World Wrestling Federation as cartoon wrestling. Well, what do they mean by cartoon wrestling? What they mean is that you had larger-than-life characters on WWF TV, okay? Hulk Hogan was a larger-than-life character, right? What do we mean by larger-than-life character? What do we mean by cartoon wrestling? What do we mean by... we just keep peeling it back here, peeling back the onion. Hulk Hogan was the first wrestler that became a mainstream megastar. Yes, you had wrestlers cross over a little bit before, such as Bruno Sammartino was featured in some non-wrestling magazines in New York. He was well known. Jerry the King Lawler appeared on the Tonight Show. Yes, we saw stuff like this. However, Hogan was on a major motion picture, a huge movie in Rocky III. Not to mention that, but he ended up being on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and he was doing the rounds with late night television shows. He hosted Saturday Night Live. Hulk Hogan was known around the United States. He was known around Canada, and he was known internationally. That's how powerful the WWF made the Hulk Hogan character, that he had this major crossover appeal. Don't let me forget, too, that he was on the A-Team for several episodes. The A-Team was the biggest show on television. Now, for those of you that are younger and can't imagine this, I go back to when I was a kid. You had like 5 channels. If you didn't have cable television, you had like 5 channels, right? That's it. There wasn't 500 channels with a million shows. You had 5 channels, right? And cable wasn't even that big. Cable was maybe like an additional 20 channels, if that. And so if a TV show got on one of the regular network channels, that was a really big deal. Like, the show was getting millions and millions and millions of viewers. So for Hulk Hogan to be on the A-Team, which was one of the biggest shows on television, it was huge. Huge. So this is the crossover appeal that the WWF had. This is what people refer to as cartoon wrestling. Okay? Hulk Hogan, when you watched a Hulk Hogan match, love him or hate him, I personally am a big Hulk Hogan fan because I grew up as a Hulkamaniac, and I knew how powerful 80s wrestling was because I got the chance to live it, right? I was a fan when it was happening. I had the LJNs. My friends and I, that's all we talked about in school was pro wrestling. And if Saturday night's main event was on, oh my goodness, you scheduled sleepovers at each other's houses for Saturday night's main event. Okay? Wrestling was the biggest thing when I was a kid. I don't think it's that way anymore. But that's the way it was when I was a kid in the 80s. So a Hulk Hogan match, right, usually started out with some brawling going in Hogan's favor. Then there was some brawling going in the heel's favor. Then there was some rest holds, some stretch moves, that kind of stuff going on. Then Hulk Hogan would Hulk up. Then he would come back and win the match, right? It was a really simple match. There wasn't 40,000 high spots. There wasn't generally chair shots, stuff like that. It was a simple formula. And Hulk Hogan wrestled that formula all throughout the 80s. And it was the same formula he used on house shows and everything else, right? It was a safe formula. Hogan was a man of demand. They wanted him, the fans wanted Hogan in their town every night around the country, around Canada, right? So Hogan wrestled this style to protect his body, and it still got over. He did as little as possible to get the most impact and to get over the most. It's the same theory by the Honky Tonk Man and many others, and it was successful, and it's why they ended up having 25, 30-year careers, okay? This was not generally liked by fans of other styles, by fans of other promotions, okay? They considered this like a cheap wrestling, a cartoon wrestling. They're not doing much for the match. You travel down to the Mid-Atlantic territory, which is Jim Crockett Promotions, you had a much different story. If you watch a card from Jim Crockett Promotions in 1986 and watch a card of the World Wrestling Federation in 1986, you are going to see a profound difference. I'm not necessarily talking about television because both were, for the most part, squash matches. But if you go and watch like the big events for like Starrcade 86, that kind of stuff, the work rate in Jim Crockett Promotions was far superior to that of the World Wrestling Federation. Ric Flair was doing 30-minute matches, right? And in a lot of cases, it was bloodbaths. He was bloodied, and they were doing just ridiculous marathon, epic matches. In fact, Flair's matches are still talked about to this day. That was the impact, right? I couldn't tell you a Hogan match that really comes to mind to me outside of maybe when he wrestled Savage at WrestleMania 5, but I could name you 5 or 6 Ric Flair matches that I still recall to this day that are ingrained in my brain of just watching and going, wow. But it wasn't just Ric Flair. You had the Rock and Roll Express down there, right? Who could go like mad. Dusty Rhodes, who was overweight in what he was, Dusty could still do a 30-minute match that was a thing of beauty. You had, now granted, in 1987, Steamboat's up in New York, but you had Ricky Steamboat down in Jim Crockett Promotions for all these years, right? So Crockett was considered the wrestling territory. You were going to see wrestling in Crockett. You were seeing more of a show in the WWF, but in Crockett, you were seeing wrestling. So in the game here, they give us an option for the classic Southern wrestling product, right? And it reads that it's the most closely associated with the 70s and 80s in the Southern U.S. This is professional wrestling being treated as real, but with larger-than-life characters and storylines. So 90% matches, 10% angles, 70% matches, 30% angles. Southern wrestling best describes exactly what Jim Crockett Promotions was. Jim Crockett Promotions was, if you watch Jim Crockett Promotions from like 83 to 87, it is just fantastic. I mean, you're talking Barry Windham, Ronnie Garvin, Jimmy Garvin was down there. The list just goes on and on and on. The Horsemen, don't forget about Blanchard and Anderson. Don't forget about Ole Anderson. The list just goes on and on. And these guys could go, right? They could go. And when you're talking about booking styles and you're talking about different products in TEW, I think that pretty much describes it, right? Now let's take a look at some other promotions here because we got a whole bunch of them in this game, and I was able to edit a lot of them. You had Memphis style, right? Memphis was another promotion that was big sellouts every night. We put them to classic Southern wrestling too. Memphis was another one where you weren't going to see a lot of crazy high spots and crap like that. You were going to see simple in-ring action, and they could go in Memphis. You were also able to see a lot of older wrestlers in Memphis who could still go because they could work the style. A lot of rest holds, slow the match down, basic mat wrestling type stuff. That's what you had going, right? And that's just the differences in styles and the differences in booking styles. You know, another thing to bring up with booking was that titles were respected a lot differently back then than they are now. In the World Wrestling Federation, the heavyweight champion, he would hold on to that title for years in most situations, unless it was a transitional situation, right? Bob Backlund, I think, had the belt for 5 years. Bruno had the belt for 8 years and then had the belt for another 4 years, I think. Hogan had that 84 to 88 run. And then you started seeing year reigns, and then things died down from there. But the champion was a really big, respected, honored thing in most promotions. The NWA was very similar under Crockett also. Flair, I think, had that 3-year reign with the title, maybe a little bit longer. And champions were just looked at, you know, this is the face of the organization. And it wasn't something that was just passed around. It wasn't something where everybody got a turn. I get quite irritated, actually, when I go on a bunch of old school wrestling boards and stuff like that. And you see these people that just, they don't know what they're talking about. And they say stupid stuff like, you know, Jake Roberts should have had a title reign. He should have been world champion. You know, you hear stuff like that. No, Roberts wasn't going to be the world heavyweight champion. And you know why Jake Roberts wasn't going to be the world heavyweight champion? Because he was a drug addict that was unreliable. That's why he wasn't going to be the world heavyweight champion. The WWF was running 3 towns a night, right? They had 3 sellout towns a night that they were running on their tour schedule. One of their champions, either the world heavyweight champion, the intercontinental heavyweight champion, or the world tag team champion, was generally on top of the card, right? Do you really think that WWF was going to trust Jake Roberts to have one of its titles and be on the top of the card when Jake Roberts, you never knew if he was going to, drink too much the night before or get too doped up the night before and not make it to the show? And that's the cold hard truth. So, it's not only Jake Roberts, your stuff like King Kong Bundy should have had a run as champion, and stuff like that. No. Hulk Hogan was bringing in the WWF all that cross-market appeal that we just talked about and was also probably earning the company $100 million a year. And that is probably low, everybody. They may have been making even more money than that with the merchandising and everything else that was going on. So no, the title wasn't going to go off of Hogan. It wasn't Hogan, Hogan wouldn't give him the title. No, they're not going to take the title off of Hogan when he's bringing in that much revenue. It just doesn't make sense. And it wouldn't have made sense to do that back then. And titles were just it was a lot different of a thing back then, and it was really respected. Nowadays, I couldn't even tell you who, outside of Roman Reigns, I couldn't tell you who any of the champions are in the WWF or WWE. And frankly, I really don't care, right? They ruined, in my opinion, the WWF, WWE, WWF, WWE, whatever you want, WW, who cares? Ruined all their titles in the mid to late 90s when they started having titles change hands like every week. I mean, Triple H is what? Like the 105-time World Heavyweight Champion with a total combined reigns of maybe a year, right? So, did the title really mean anything if it was changing hands that much? And that's a knock on the Memphis Wrestling, too. Memphis Wrestling had their titles change hands like weekly. So, did the titles really mean anything? I don't know. So we're moving right along here to products. We're going down to World Class. And we went through these, and Classic Wild West is perfect for World Class. Perfectly describes it. Bloody, brawling, nasty, physical. Absolutely. So it's in there. World Class, for those of you that don't know, was a member of the NWA up until 1986. Now, they stopped using NWA titles in, I think, 1983 and introduced their own titles, became the World Class American Heavyweight title and stuff like that. But they eventually broke away from the NWA and named their own World Heavyweight Champion in 1986. And Rick Rude, who was the American Heavyweight Champion at the time, actually was named the first World Heavyweight Champion of World Class. World Class had a totally different style. It wasn't a Southern style. It wasn't the WWF style. It was their own style. It was hard-hitting action. And if you watch World Class to this day, the quality still holds up. They had just a beautiful, excellent, light years ahead sports presentation for their show, World Class Championship Wrestling. It looked terrific. The way their lighting was and everything, the way the camera angles were, they were light years ahead of everybody else. Obviously, by 1987, the WWF had the greatest production out there, but World Class was right up there with them. It was just a fantastic presentation, and World Class definitely has its place in history because, to me, it's the greatest overachiever of all time, right? It was technically a one-town territory. Now, they traveled around Texas. Yes, they traveled to Israel and stuff like that. But they had this presentation that they were this worldwide promotion, and they weren't. They were just a one-town promotion. But it was good stuff, and World Class has their own style. They had their own booking style also. Lots of titles, lots of crazy stuff going on, and that, I think, is shown in the game, and we got the product style down right, I believe. All right, what else is there to talk about? We made the adjustments over to All Japan and New Japan, too. And, of course, I can't speak highly enough about All Japan and New Japan. In the 1980s, it's my belief that the greatest pro wrestling ever made was All Japan Pro Wrestling, 1980 to 2000. But that's just my belief, right? So they are All Japan set for traditional Puro Riso, the Japanese slang style for pro wrestling, right? 100% matches, 100% matches. You saw some promos in All Japan, but they were few and far between. But I feel that this definitely sums them up the best. Very physical style of wrestling, emphasis on brawling, throws, submissions. I think it nails what All Japan was. Now we took a look at New Japan. And New Japan, we went with strong Puro Riso, right? In between of wrestling as a sport and shoot style wrestling. And that's exactly what Antonio Inoki was doing over there. Antonio Inoki was trying to have worked shoot matches, right? That's exactly what he was trying to do with his promotion. And actually, when he left New Japan Pro Wrestling, that's what he pursued with UFO and some other promotions that he dabbled in. All right, so that is mainly what we're talking about with booking styles and obviously the product changes in the 1987 Supermod. Of course, this will all be part of version 10.1, but I think it was important to discuss that so that people really understand how 80s wrestling was and the variances and differences in it, because there was profound differences between the promotions. You can see why Southern Wrestling didn't care for the WWF, and you can see why people in the Northeast and New England in that were kind of foreign to the Southern product, because they tried running. Crockett tried running in the Northeast. He tried running in New Jersey. He tried running in New York, and it didn't really work out for him. He was also running the Pittsburgh Civic Center and areas like that, and it just didn't really work out for him. It was almost like they weren't accepting of each other. The different territories couldn't really jive in the other territories. We could also go all the way back to when Vince McMahon bought the time slot at Georgia Championship Wrestling, took over the time slot Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS, and was showing WWF matches. And eventually, the people were so fired up that they wanted their Gordon Soley wrestling back that McMahon ended up selling the slot to Jim Crockett Jr., who then turned that used that for World Championship Wrestling. It just was the WWF style was not accepted in the South. So here we have for the AWA, they are running Silver Age Pro Wrestling, right? Work rate's more important, but there's still, a little bit of a balance. And that's pretty true to life with the AWA. AWA, of course, was in major trouble at this point in 87. Vern Gagne was starting to hemorrhage money. And they would make it all the way till 89 and then officially close in 91. And Vern Gagne just unfortunately lost everything. But it wasn't only because of the wrestling promotion. He was fighting a lawsuit to retain his property in Lake Minnetonka, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that the state of Minnesota was trying to take over for a public park or forest preserve or something like that. So, all right, everybody, that's going to do it for this episode. I know we bounced all over the place, but I thought it was a good idea to talk about different booking styles, to talk about the different products in the game, and I hope maybe you learned something. And I consider myself a student of wrestling, and I listen to about 7 different podcasts a week, and I try to learn all this stuff for myself because I find the 1980s to be the most fascinating time in pro wrestling. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.